The winter of 1872 stretched across the Oregon Territory like a frozen wasteland, and Sarah Mitchell felt every bitter wind cut through her worn shawl as she stood outside the military fort. Her husband's body lay somewhere in the lava beds where the Modoc warriors had made their stand, and she had traveled 300 miles through snow and ice just to hear the word missing from a uniformed officer who barely looked at her when he delivered the news. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the letter from the War Department, its official seal now meaningless in the face of her reality. Captain James Mitchell had been part of the expedition sent to remove the Modoc people from their ancestral lands and force them onto a reservation with their traditional enemies. The irony wasn't lost on her that her husband had died, trying to move people from their home while she herself had been forced to leave everything behind in Pennsylvania after her father's farm failed. The fort buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for what they called the final assault on Captain Jack's stronghold. Sarah listened to their confident talk about ending the Modoc resistance once and for all, but she saw something different in their eyes when they thought no one was watching. Fear. The Modoc warriors, led by a man the whites called Captain Jack but whose real name was Kintpuash, had been holding off the United States Army for months from their position in the lava beds. 53 Modoc fighters against nearly 1,000 soldiers, and somehow the warriors kept winning. Sarah found lodging in a boarding house run by Mrs. Catherine Brennan, an Irish woman whose own husband had died in the California gold fields. Catherine's weathered face told stories of loss that matched Sarah's own, and for the first time in months Sarah felt understood without having to speak. The two women shared meals in comfortable silence, both knowing that words couldn't fill the emptiness left by men who had chased dreams into dangerous places. On her third day at the fort, Sarah witnessed something that would change everything. A young Modoc man, barely 20 years old, was brought in under heavy guard. His name was Scarface Charlie, though Sarah would later learn his real name was Chopunish. Unlike the other prisoners she had seen, this young man walked with his head high, his dark eyes meeting those of his captors without flinching. What struck her most was the wooden bow he carried, which the soldiers had somehow allowed him to keep. The commanding officer, General Edward Canby, questioned the young warrior through an interpreter. Sarah positioned herself where she could hear the conversation, drawn by something she couldn't name. Scarface. Charlie spoke of his people's connection to the land, of promises broken by the government, and of a father who had taught him that some things were worth dying for. His voice carried no hatred, only a deep sadness that seemed to echo Sarah's own grief. During the interrogation, Scarface Charlie's eyes found Sarah's through the crowd of onlookers. For a moment that felt like eternity, two people from completely different worlds looked at each other and recognized the same profound loss. The young warrior had lost his homeland, his freedom, and many of his people. Sarah had lost her husband, her security, and her faith in the promises made by powerful men. In that shared glance, something shifted in both of them. That evening, Sarah approached Mrs. Brennan with questions about the Modoc people. Catherine, who had lived in Oregon for 15 years, told her stories that the newspapers never printed. She spoke of Modoc families torn apart when they were forced onto the Klamath Reservation, of children who died from diseases brought by white settlers, and of a proud people who had tried repeatedly to make peace only to have their treaties broken. Catherine's husband had traded with the Modocs before his death, and she described them as honest, intelligent people who simply wanted to live on the land where their ancestors were buried. As Sarah listened, she began to understand that her husband had died not in some glorious battle for civilization, but in a war built on broken promises and cultural misunderstanding. The realization filled her with a different kind of grief, one that carried anger and confusion alongside the familiar pain of loss. She had supported James's military service, believing it served a noble cause, but now she wondered if she had sent the man she loved to die for something fundamentally wrong. The next morning brought news that would shake the entire fort. General Canby and another peace commissioner had been killed during what was supposed to be a peaceful negotiation with Captain Jack. The Modoc leader had pulled a hidden pistol and shot Canby point blank, making him the highest-ranking military officer ever killed by Native Americans. The fort erupted in calls for revenge, and Sarah watched as any hope for peaceful resolution died with the general. In the chaos that followed, Scarface Charlie was moved to a more secure holding area, but not before Sarah caught sight of him again. This time, The young warrior looked directly at her and spoke words in English that she would never forget. "Will you join my father's heart?" The phrase made no sense to the soldiers around him, and they dismissed it as the ramblings of a defeated enemy. But Sarah felt those words settle into her soul like seeds waiting for the right season to grow. That night, as she lay awake listening to the sounds of war preparations outside her window, Sarah realized that her journey to Oregon had brought her to something far more significant than simply learning about her husband's fate. She was standing at the intersection of two worlds, two ways of understanding life and death, loss and hope. The young Modoc's words echoed in her mind, and she began to sense that they contained an invitation to something she didn't yet understand, but desperately needed to find. The dying fire of her hope was about to encounter a wind that would either extinguish it forever or fan it into something entirely new. Sarah Mitchell, widow and stranger in a strange land, was about to discover that sometimes the most unlikely connections can bridge the deepest divides, and that healing can come from the most unexpected sources. 3 days after General Canby's death, the fort transformed into a fortress of rage and revenge. Sarah watched from her boarding house window as soldiers sharpened bayonets and loaded ammunition wagons with grim determination. The talk of peaceful negotiation had died with the general, replaced by promises of swift and brutal justice against the Modoc people. Colonel Alvin Gillum, now in command, announced that Captain Jack and his followers would be hunted down like wild animals, and every conversation Sarah overheard seemed to compete in describing the terrible fate awaiting the warriors. Yet even in this atmosphere of hatred, Sarah found herself thinking about the young warrior's mysterious words. Mrs. Brennan noticed her distraction during their morning meal and finally asked what troubled her beyond the obvious grief. Sarah hesitated, knowing how strange her story would sound, but something about Catherine's kind eyes encouraged honesty. She described the moment when Scarface Charlie had looked at her and spoken of joining his father's heart. Catherine set down her coffee cup with unusual force, her weathered hands trembling slightly. She had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the weight of certain moments, and something in Sarah's description resonated with memories of her own husband's stories about Modoc customs. Patrick Brennan had spent considerable time trading with various tribes before his death, and he had often spoken of the profound spiritual connections that guided Native American life. Catherine suspected that the young warrior's words carried meaning far deeper than anyone at the fort could understand. That afternoon, against all regulations and common sense, Catherine arranged for Sarah to speak with Father Thomas McKenna, the Catholic chaplain who had been ministering to both soldiers and prisoners. Father McKenna was an unusual man for his position, having learned several native languages during his years serving frontier communities. When Sarah repeated Scarface Charlie's words, the priest's expression grew thoughtful and deeply troubled. Father McKenna explained that among many tribes, the concept of joining someone's heart referred to becoming part of their spiritual family, sharing their burdens and their hopes. For a Modoc warrior to offer such an invitation to a white woman whose husband had died fighting his people represented something almost unprecedented. The priest suggested that the young man had somehow recognized in Sarah a kindred spirit, someone whose grief matched his own people's suffering. But he warned her that pursuing such a connection could be seen as treason by the military authorities. Sarah left the chaplain's quarters with her mind spinning. The idea that a Modoc warrior had seen something in her that she didn't even see in herself both frightened and intrigued her. She had come to Oregon seeking closure about her husband's death, but instead found herself confronting questions about the nature of the conflict that had killed him. For the first time since receiving the news of James's disappearance, she felt something other than numbness and despair. The next morning brought a development that would test everyone's resolve. A small group of Modoc women and children, including Scarface Charlie's younger sister, arrived at the fort under a flag of truce. They had walked through enemy lines in the middle of the night, risking everything to plead for the life of their captured warrior. The sight of these desperate women and frightened children created an uncomfortable stir among the soldiers, many of whom had been preparing to fight an enemy they could imagine as savage and inhuman. Sarah watched from the boarding house steps as the Modoc women were brought before Colonel Gillum. The leader of the group was an elderly woman named Wiauka, whose dignity remained unbroken despite her obvious exhaustion and fear. Through an interpreter, she explained that Scarface Charlie was not just a warrior, but a keeper of sacred songs, one of the few young men who still remembered the old ways of his people. His death would mean the loss of cultural knowledge that could never be replaced. What happened next surprised everyone present. Scarface Charlie's sister, a girl of perhaps 16, stepped forward and began to sing in the Modoc language. Her voice carried across the fort grounds with haunting beauty, and even soldiers who understood nothing of her words found themselves stopping their work to listen. The song spoke of mountains and rivers, of ancestors and children yet unborn, of a connection to the land that transcended individual life and death. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the girl's voice washed over her. Without fully understanding why, she found herself walking toward the group of Modoc women. The soldiers made no move to stop her, perhaps too moved by the singing to think clearly about regulations. When she reached the women, the elderly Wauka looked at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The interpreter, a mixed-blood man named Dave Hill, hesitated before translating Wauka's words. She says you carry the same wounded spirit as her grandson. She asks if you are the woman he spoke of, the one whose heart walks in darkness like ours. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood the full meaning of the question. Wauka reached out and took Sarah's hands in her own weathered ones. Speaking again in Modoc before turning to the interpreter, Dave Hill looked uncomfortable as he translated, "She says her grandson saw in you someone who could help bridge the darkness between our peoples. She says he offered to share his father's heart because he recognized that your grief and ours come from the same broken promises. She wants to know if you will help carry their story to those who make decisions about life and death." Colonel Gillum interrupted the conversation, ordering the Modoc women to be taken to a secure area until he could decide their fate. But as they were led away, Wauka pressed something into Sarah's hand. It was a small piece of obsidian, polished smooth and carved with symbols Sarah didn't recognize. The elderly woman whispered something in Modoc that didn't need translation, her eyes conveying a message of hope and desperate trust. That night, Sarah sat in her room examining the obsidian piece by lamplight. She had come to Oregon as a widow seeking information about her husband's death, but somehow she had become entangled in something much larger and more complex. The young Modoc warrior's invitation to join his father's heart was beginning to make sense, not as a romantic notion, but as a call to become part of a struggle for understanding that could honor both her husband's memory and the Modoc people's right to exist. Mrs. Brennan found her still awake at dawn, staring out the window at the mountains where the last free Modocs were making their final stand. Catherine didn't need to ask what Sarah was thinking about. The two women had known too much loss to believe in simple answers, but they had also lived long enough to recognize when life offered unexpected opportunities for meaning and redemption. The question now was whether Sarah had the courage to accept an invitation that could change everything she thought she knew about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of healing ancient wounds. The obsidian stone grew warm in Sarah's palm as she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She approached Father McKenna the following morning with a request that left the chaplain speechless. She wanted to visit Scarface Charlie in his cell. The priest's initial response was to explain the absolute impossibility of such a meeting, but something in Sarah's expression made him pause. He had seen that same determined look in the eyes of other women who had lost everything and found unexpected strength in their desperation. Father McKenna spent the afternoon in careful negotiation with Colonel Gillum, presenting Sarah's request as a matter of Christian mercy and potential intelligence gathering. The colonel was suspicious but intrigued by the possibility that a grieving widow might extract useful information from the prisoner. After considerable debate, he agreed to allow a brief supervised meeting, with the chaplain present as translator, and 2 guards stationed outside the cell. The fort's detention area was a crude wooden structure that seemed designed more to intimidate than to hold prisoners securely. Sarah followed Father McKenna through a narrow corridor that smelled of dampness and fear, her heart pounding with uncertainty about what she hoped to accomplish. When they reached Scarface Charlie's cell, she found the young warrior sitting cross-legged on the floor, his wooden bow resting across his knees as if it were a sacred object rather than a weapon. Scarface. Charlie looked up as they approached, and Sarah saw no surprise in his dark eyes, only a quiet recognition that suggested he had somehow expected this meeting. Father McKenna spoke to him in halting Modoc. explaining Sarah's identity and her request to understand his earlier words. The young warrior listened carefully before responding. In English, that was better than most of the soldiers had realized. I spoke of my father's heart because I saw in your eyes the same knowledge that comes to those who have watched their world die, Scarface Charlie said, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed older than his years. My father taught me that the heart can hold many kinds of truth, and that sometimes understanding comes only when we share the burden of carrying what seems impossible to bear alone. Sarah found herself sitting on the floor across from him, ignoring the guard's disapproving looks. She pulled the obsidian stone from her pocket and held it between them. Your grandmother gave me this. I don't understand what it means, but I feel like it's important in ways I can't explain. Scarface Charlie smiled for the first time since Sarah had seen him, an expression that transformed his face from that of a hardened warrior to something much younger and more vulnerable. That stone comes from the sacred mountain where my people believe the spirits of our ancestors watch over us. My grandmother has given you something that connects you to our family in a way that goes deeper than blood. She believes you can help carry our story to places where we cannot go. Father McKenna translated parts of their conversation for his own understanding, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his genuine interest in the cultural exchange taking place. The chaplain had ministered to many dying soldiers and grieving families, but he had never witnessed anything quite like the connection developing between these two people from completely different worlds. As they talked, Scarface Charlie began to share stories about his people that no military report had ever captured. He spoke of Modoc children learning to read the patterns of migrating birds, of elders who could predict weather changes by watching the behavior of animals, and of a complex system of governance that had kept the peace among various tribes for generations. Sarah listened with growing amazement as she realized that the savage enemy, described in newspaper accounts, was actually a sophisticated culture with traditions that stretched back thousands of years. The young warrior also talked about his father, a man named Kindpus, who had tried repeatedly to negotiate peaceful coexistence with white settlers. Scarface Charlie explained that his father's heart had been broken not by military defeat, but by the realization that most white people seemed incapable of understanding that the Modoc people had their own valid way of life. The invitation to join his father's heart was an offer to help bridge that gap of understanding, to become someone who could speak for the Modoc people in places where they would never be heard. Your husband died because he believed he was protecting something valuable, Scarface Charlie said quietly. My people are dying because we are trying to protect something equally valuable. Perhaps if more people understood that both sides are fighting for things that matter, there might be a way to honor both without destroying either. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door that had been locked since James's death was finally beginning to open. She had spent months consumed by grief and anger, but sitting across from this young warrior, she began to see her loss as part of something larger than her personal tragedy. The possibility that her husband's death might gain meaning through her involvement in finding a peaceful solution to the conflict was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Father McKenna watched this exchange with growing concern and admiration. As a man of God, he appreciated the spiritual dimension of what was happening, but as someone who understood military politics, he recognized the dangerous territory Sarah was entering. He gently reminded her that sympathizing too openly with the Modoc cause could be seen as treason, especially in the current atmosphere of revenge that pervaded the fort. Before they left, Scarface Charlie made a request that surprised everyone present. He asked Sarah to take a message to his grandmother and the other Modoc women being held at the fort. The message was simple but profound. He wanted them to know that he had found someone willing to carry their story beyond the boundaries of the conflict, and that his father's heart was no longer walking alone in the darkness. That evening, Sarah sat with Mrs. Brennan and shared everything that had happened in the cell. Catherine listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped Sarah clarify her own thoughts and feelings. The Irish woman had lived through enough frontier conflicts to understand that the line between enemy and ally was often much thinner than people liked to believe. She also recognized that Sarah was being offered an opportunity to find purpose in her pain, something that could transform her grief into something constructive rather than simply destructive. As they talked late into the night, Sarah began to formulate a plan that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She would find a way to tell the Modoc story to people who had the power to influence policy and public opinion. She would become the bridge that Scarface Charlie's father's heart had been waiting for, someone who could help others understand that the conflict in the lava beds was not simply about law and order, but about the survival of an entire way of life. The obsidian stone sat on the table between them, catching the lamplight in ways that seemed almost alive. Sarah realized that accepting Scarface Charlie's invitation meant accepting responsibility for something much larger than her own healing. But for the first time since learning of James's death, she felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond her personal grief into something that might actually matter in the wider world. Sarah's plan began to take shape when she learned that a delegation of Eastern politicians and newspaper correspondents would arrive at the fort within the week to assess the military situation and report back to Washington. Among them was Congressman William Morrison from Illinois, a man known for his interest in frontier affairs and his occasional criticism of aggressive military policies toward Native Americans. Sarah realized that this might be her only opportunity to share the Modoc perspective with someone who had the power to influence national policy. Mrs. Brennan used her connections in the local community to arrange a meeting with the congressman's advance coordinator, a young aide named Benjamin Fletcher, who had traveled ahead to prepare for the delegation's visit. Sarah carefully crafted her approach, presenting herself not as a sympathizer to the enemy cause but as a widow seeking to understand the circumstances that had led to her husband's death. Her genuine grief and obvious intelligence impressed Fletcher enough that he agreed to arrange a brief audience with Congressman Morrison. Meanwhile, Sarah had begun regular visits to the area where the Modoc women and children were being held. Father McKenna facilitated these meetings by framing them as Christian charity work, and Colonel Gillum reluctantly allowed them to continue as long as they were supervised. During these visits, Sarah learned more about Modoc culture and history than any official report had ever contained. The elderly Wiauka became her primary teacher, sharing stories and perspectives that revealed the depth and complexity of her people's relationship with the land. Through these conversations, Sarah discovered that the current conflict was the culmination of decades of broken promises and cultural misunderstanding. The Modoc people had originally agreed to move to the Klamath Reservation, but found themselves forced to live among traditional enemies who spoke a different language and followed different customs. When they tried to return to their ancestral homeland, they were told that white settlers now owned the land their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. Wiauka explained the concept that had confused Sarah since her first conversation with Scarface Charlie. In Modoc tradition, the heart of a father represents the spiritual center of family and tribal identity. When someone joins another's father's heart, they become responsible for carrying that family's hopes, dreams, and sacred obligations. Scarface Charlie's invitation was not just personal friendship, but a formal adoption into the spiritual responsibility of preserving and protecting Modoc cultural identity. The weight of this responsibility both honored and frightened Sarah. She had never considered herself particularly brave or influential, but she was beginning to understand that sometimes ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary positions to make a difference. The death of her husband had brought her to this place at this moment, and she was starting to believe that perhaps his sacrifice could serve a purpose larger than either of them had ever imagined. When Congressman Morrison arrived at the fort, Sarah was surprised to find him younger and more approachable than she had expected. Benjamin Fletcher had prepared him for their meeting by describing her as an intelligent widow seeking to understand the broader context of the conflict. Morrison was genuinely interested in hearing perspectives that differed from the standard military briefings he would receive from Colonel Gillum and other officers. Sarah spent an hour with the congressman, carefully sharing what she had learned about Modoc culture and the historical background to the current conflict. She presented Wiauka's perspective on the failed reservation experience and the cultural reasons why the Modoc people felt they had no choice but to resist further removal from their homeland. Morrison listened intently, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of the complex political and social issues at stake. What impressed Morrison most was Sarah's ability to present the Modoc viewpoint without minimizing the legitimate concerns of white settlers and military personnel. She acknowledged that there had been violence and tragedy on both sides, but argued that the root cause of the conflict lay in a failure of imagination and empathy, rather than inherent savagery or civilizational incompatibility. Her personal stake in the matter, combined with her obvious intelligence and sincerity, gave her words a credibility that purely academic or journalistic accounts might have lacked. Morrison was particularly interested in Sarah's description of Modoc governance and social organization. Like many educated Americans of his era, he had assumed that Native American societies were primitive and chaotic. But Sarah's account revealed a complex system of leadership, law, and cultural preservation that had maintained social stability for generations. The congressman began to understand that the military was not just fighting against individual warriors, but was attempting to destroy an entire way of life that had its own validity and value. During their conversation, Sarah made a bold request. She asked Morrison to meet personally with Wauka and hear directly from a Modoc elder about her people's perspective on the conflict. This was a risky proposition, as any official recognition of Modoc leadership could be seen as legitimizing their resistance to federal authority. However, Morrison was intrigued enough by Sarah's description of the elderly woman's wisdom and dignity to agree to an informal meeting. The meeting between Congressman Morrison and Wauka took place in Father McKenna's quarters, with the chaplain serving as translator and Sarah acting as cultural interpreter. Wauka appeared in her finest remaining clothing, carrying herself with a dignity that immediately impressed the congressman. Through careful translation, she shared her people's version of the events that had led to the current conflict, emphasizing their repeated attempts to find peaceful solutions and their deep spiritual connection to their ancestral homeland. Morrison asked Wauka what she thought would be necessary to end the current conflict without further bloodshed. Her response, delivered through Father McKenna's translation, was both simple and profound. Her people needed to be allowed to live somewhere that honored their cultural identity and spiritual obligations, whether that was on their original homeland or on a reservation that could accommodate their way of life. She emphasized that the Modoc people did not want to make war, but they could not survive cultural extinction. The congressman left that meeting with a fundamentally different understanding of the conflict than he had possessed when he arrived at the fort. Sarah's careful preparation and Wauka's authentic presentation had accomplished something that no military report or newspaper account had managed. They had humanized the Modoc resistance and revealed it as a struggle for cultural survival rather than mere defiance of lawful authority. As Morrison prepared to return to Washington, he thanked Sarah for her unique perspective and promised to share what he had learned with other members of Congress. He also made a commitment that would prove crucial in the days to come. He would advocate for fair treatment of any Modoc prisoners and would oppose policies that seemed designed more for revenge than for genuine resolution of the underlying issues. That evening, Sarah returned to Scarface Charlie's cell to report on her conversation with the congressman. The young warrior listened carefully to her account, his expression growing more hopeful as she described Morrison's reaction to Wauka's presentation. For the first time since his capture, Scarface Charlie seemed to believe that there might be people in the white world who could understand and respect his people's perspective. You have begun to carry my father's heart to places where it could never go alone, he told Sarah as Father McKenna prepared to escort her back to the boarding house. Whatever happens to me, you have already honored the trust my grandmother placed in you. You have shown that it is possible for people from different worlds to find common ground in shared respect for life and dignity. Sarah left the detention area that night with a profound sense of accomplishment, but also with the sobering realization that her work was just beginning. She had successfully planted seeds of understanding in the mind of an influential politician. But changing hearts and minds was a slow process, and the military situation in the lava beds was rapidly approaching a violent conclusion. The question now was whether her small contribution to cross-cultural understanding could have any meaningful impact on the larger forces that seemed determined to destroy the Modoc people entirely. The news arrived on a cold morning in early June that would change everything for everyone involved in the Modoc conflict. Captain Jack and his remaining followers had finally been captured after months of resistance in the lava beds. The fort erupted in celebration, with soldiers cheering and officers congratulating each other on the successful conclusion of what had become an embarrassing military campaign. Sarah watched the festivities from her boarding house window with a growing sense of dread, knowing that capture meant trial, and trial almost certainly meant execution for the Modoc leaders. Within hours of the announcement, Sarah learned that Scarface Charlie would be reunited with Captain Jack and the other captured warriors for a military tribunal that would determine their fate. The young man who had invited her to join his father's heart would soon face the same justice system that had consistently failed to honor treaties with his people. Sarah realized that all her efforts to build understanding and sympathy might prove meaningless in the face of military desire for revenge and the political need to demonstrate federal authority. Mrs. Brennan found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table that evening, staring at the obsidian stone that had come to symbolize her connection to the Modoc people. Catherine had watched her friend transform over the past months from a grieving widow, seeking closure, to a woman with a profound sense of purpose, and she recognized that the capture of the Modoc leaders represented a crisis that would test everything Sarah had learned about herself and her mission. "You've done something important here," Catherine said quietly, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "You've shown that it's possible for people to understand each other across the deepest divisions. That matters even if it doesn't change what happens next." But Sarah wasn't ready to accept that her involvement was ending just as the most crucial phase was beginning. Father McKenna visited the boarding house that same evening, with news that was both encouraging and deeply troubling. Congressman Morrison had indeed kept his promise to advocate for fair treatment of Modoc prisoners, and his influence had resulted in the appointment of a civilian lawyer to represent the defendants during their military tribunal. However, the chaplain also brought word that the military was under enormous pressure from Washington to make an example of the Modoc leaders, particularly Captain Jack, who had killed General Canby during the peace negotiations. The appointed defense attorney was a young man named Marcus Whitman from San Francisco, whose previous experience had been primarily in commercial law rather than military justice or Indian affairs. Father McKenna explained that Whitman was competent, but overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the cultural barriers he faced in communicating with his clients. The chaplain suggested that Sarah's unique understanding of Modoc perspectives and her relationship with key figures like Wiauka and Scarface Charlie might prove invaluable to the defense effort. Sarah spent a sleepless night weighing the implications of becoming directly involved in the legal proceedings. Serving as a cultural consultant to the defense would mean publicly aligning herself with the accused warriors, a position that could be seen as treasonous by military authorities and frontier communities. She would be putting herself at significant personal risk for the sake of people who were almost certainly doomed, regardless of her efforts. Yet when morning came, Sarah realized that she had no real choice in the matter, accepting Scarface. Charlie's invitation to join his father's heart had created obligations that extended beyond her personal comfort or safety. She had promised to carry the Modoc story to places where it could not go alone, and the courtroom where these men would be tried for their lives was exactly such a place. Her first meeting with Marcus Whitman revealed both the challenges and the opportunities facing the defense. The young lawyer was intelligent and well-intentioned, but he had never worked with Native American clients and possessed almost no understanding of Modoc culture or history. Sarah spent hours educating him about the background to the conflict, explaining concepts like tribal governance, sacred obligations, and the spiritual significance of ancestral lands. She helped him understand that what the military characterized as rebellion and murder had very different meanings within Modoc cultural frameworks. More importantly, Sarah served as a bridge between Whitman and his clients, helping to establish trust and communication that would have been impossible otherwise. The Modoc warriors had little reason to trust any representative of the legal system that was preparing to judge them, but Sarah's acceptance into their spiritual family gave her words a credibility that even the most well-meaning white lawyer could not achieve on his own. Captain Jack proved to be a man of remarkable dignity and intelligence, whose English was considerably better than most people realized. Through Sarah's facilitation, he was able to explain to Whitman the impossible position his people had been placed in by federal policies. They had been forced to choose between cultural extinction on an unsuitable reservation or armed resistance that they knew would ultimately prove hopeless. Captain Jack had chosen resistance not because he believed it would succeed, but because some things were worth dying for. Scarface Charlie's role in the defense strategy became particularly important as the trial date approached. His youth and obvious intelligence made him a sympathetic figure, and his ability to articulate Modoc perspectives in English would allow him to testify on his own behalf. Sarah worked with both Whitman and Scarface Charlie to prepare testimony that would help the military tribunal understand the cultural and historical context of the conflict without appearing to justify the specific acts of violence that had occurred. The challenge was enormous because the military tribunal was not really designed to consider cultural context or historical grievances. Its purpose was to determine whether specific individuals had committed specific acts of violence against United States personnel and property. The broader questions of justice, cultural survival, and federal Indian policy were beyond its scope, even though those issues were central to understanding why the conflict had occurred. Sarah's most difficult task was helping Wiaka and the other Modoc women prepare for their roles as character witnesses for the accused warriors. These women needed to convey the essential humanity and cultural integrity of their men, while speaking to military officers who had been conditioned to see them as savage enemies. Sarah spent countless hours with the women, helping them craft testimony that would reveal the full dimensions of the people being judged, while remaining within the narrow confines of military legal procedure. As the trial approached, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Congressman Morrison, who had returned to Oregon specifically to observe the proceedings. The congressman had been deeply affected by his earlier conversations with Sarah and Wauka, and he wanted to ensure that the military tribunal conducted itself in a manner that would reflect well on American justice. His presence at the fort served as a reminder that the proceedings were being watched by people in Washington who cared about fairness and due process. Morrison's return also provided Sarah with an opportunity to share what she had learned during her work with the defense team. The congressman was particularly interested in her insights into Modoc culture and her assessment of whether there were lessons from this conflict that could help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Sarah found herself articulating ideas about cross-cultural understanding and conflict resolution that she had never fully formed before, but that had emerged from months of intensive interaction with people whose worldview was completely different from her own. The evening before the trial was scheduled to begin, Sarah made one final visit to Scarface Charlie in his cell. The young warrior appeared calm despite the gravity of his situation, and he thanked her for everything she had done to ensure that his people's story would be heard even in this hostile environment. He gave her his wooden bow, explaining that it had been carved by his father and contained prayers for the protection of future generations. If he did not survive the trial, he wanted Sarah to keep the bow as a reminder of her obligation to continue carrying his father's heart into whatever future awaited. Sarah accepted the bow with hands that trembled from the weight of what it represented. She realized that regardless of what happened in the courtroom, her life had been permanently changed by her involvement with the Modoc people. She was no longer simply a widow seeking to understand her husband's death, but someone who had become responsible for preserving and sharing cultural knowledge that might otherwise disappear entirely. The young warrior's invitation to join his father's heart had transformed her from an observer of tragedy into an active participant in the struggle for justice and understanding. As she prepared for sleep that night, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled to Oregon seeking closure about her personal loss, but had found instead a calling that connected her to issues much larger than her individual grief. The trial that would begin tomorrow would determine the fate of the Modoc warriors, but it would also test whether the American justice system could find room for cultural understanding and humanitarian concern in its pursuit of law and order. The obsidian stone sat on her nightstand, catching the lamplight in ways that seemed to pulse with life. Sarah understood now that accepting Scarface Charlie's invitation had been the beginning of a transformation that would continue long after the immediate crisis was resolved. She had learned to see the world through different eyes, to understand that truth could take many forms, and to recognize that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with words, empathy, and the courage to stand up for people who had no other advocates. Tomorrow would bring whatever justice the military tribunal was capable of dispensing, but tonight Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had honored the trust placed in her by the Modoc people. She had carried their story into places where it could not go alone, and in doing so, she had discovered aspects of herself that she never knew existed. The dying fire of her hope had indeed been rekindled, but in ways she could never have imagined when she first arrived at the fort months earlier. The obsidian stone sat on her nightstand, catching the lamplight in ways that seemed to pulse with life. Sarah understood now that accepting Scarface Charlie's invitation had been the beginning of a transformation that would continue long after the immediate crisis was resolved. She had learned to see the world through different eyes, to understand that truth could take many forms, and to recognize that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with words, empathy, and the courage to stand up for people who had no other advocates. Tomorrow would bring whatever justice the military tribunal was capable of dispensing. But tonight, Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had honored the trust placed in her by the Modoc people. She had carried their story into places where it could not go alone, and in doing so she had discovered aspects of herself that she never knew existed. The dying fire of her hope had indeed been rekindled, but in ways she could never have imagined when she first arrived at the fort months earlier. The military tribunal convened on a sweltering July morning in a makeshift courtroom that had been constructed specifically for the proceedings. Sarah sat in the section reserved for observers, watching as Captain Jack, Scarface Charlie, and 4 other Modoc warriors were led into the room wearing shackles that seemed designed as much for symbolic effect as for security. The contrast between the formal military protocol and the profound cultural divide being played out in the courtroom was almost overwhelming in its stark brutality. Colonel Gillum presided over the tribunal with an air of grim determination, flanked by 2 other officers whose expressions suggested that they had already reached their conclusions about the guilt of the accused. The charges were read in English without translation, despite the fact that several of the defendants had limited understanding of the language in which they were being judged. Sarah watched Scarface Charlie's face as the accusations of murder and treason were recited, seeing in his eyes not fear but a profound sadness at the inability of 2 cultures to find common ground, even in this final setting. Marcus Whitman rose to present his opening statement with obvious nervousness, but his words carried a conviction that had grown stronger during his weeks of preparation with Sarah and the Modoc witnesses. He argued that the tribunal could not render just judgment without understanding the historical and cultural context that had led to the conflict. He reminded the court that the Modoc people had repeatedly sought peaceful solutions to their forced removal, and that their resistance had been a last resort driven by the impossible choice between cultural extinction and armed defiance. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning in its simplicity. Government witnesses testified about specific acts of violence committed by the defendants, particularly Captain Jack's killing of General Canby during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation. The military prosecutors painted a picture of savage treachery that required swift and decisive punishment to maintain federal authority and protect innocent settlers from future violence. When Whitman began presenting the defense case, Sarah felt her heart pounding as Wauka took the witness stand. The elderly Modoc woman appeared fragile in the formal courtroom setting, but her voice carried across the room with quiet dignity as she testified about her people's history and their relationship to the land they had been forced to leave. Through careful translation by Father McKenna, she explained the spiritual obligations that connected the Modoc people to their ancestral homeland and the cultural devastation that resulted from forced relocation to an unsuitable reservation. Scarface Charlie's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the defense case. Speaking in English that was clear and articulate, he addressed the tribunal directly about the impossible position his people had faced. He acknowledged that violence had occurred, but he placed it in the context of a people fighting for their very survival as a distinct culture. His words carried no hatred for his captors, only a deep sadness that the conflict had been necessary and a hope that future generations might find better ways to resolve such fundamental differences. "We did not choose this war because we wanted to kill," Scarface Charlie told the tribunal, his voice steady despite the chains that bound his hands. "We chose it because we could not choose to stop being Modoc people. When you take away everything that makes a people who they are, you leave them with nothing to lose. We fought not from hatred, but from love for the children who will come after us and the ancestors who came before." Sarah watched the faces of the tribunal members as they listened to this testimony, seeing in some of them the first glimmers of doubt about the simple narrative of savage rebellion that had brought them to this courtroom. However, she also recognized that understanding the cultural context of the conflict was very different from finding legal justification for acts of violence against federal officials. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Marcus Whitman called Sarah herself as a witness to testify about her interactions with the defendants and her understanding of Modoc culture. Sarah had not expected to take the stand, but Whitman argued that her unique perspective as both a military widow and someone who had been formally adopted into Modoc's spiritual family provided crucial insight into the human dimensions of the conflict. Sarah's testimony was unlike anything the tribunal had heard. She spoke about her husband's death and her initial anger toward the Modoc people, then described how her interactions with Scarface Charlie and Wauka had gradually revealed the complexity of the issues at stake. She explained the concept of joining another's father's heart and what it had meant for her to accept responsibility for carrying Modoc stories and perspectives to audiences who would never hear them otherwise. These men are not the savage murderers described by the prosecution, Sarah told the tribunal, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. They are fathers and sons and keepers of ancient wisdom who found themselves facing an impossible choice. They chose to fight rather than watch their people disappear, and while I cannot excuse the violence that resulted, I can understand the desperation that drove them to it. My husband died in this conflict, but I have learned that his death was part of a larger tragedy that consumed good people on both sides. The prosecution's cross-examination of Sarah was aggressive, attempting to portray her as a woman whose grief had clouded her judgment and made her susceptible to manipulation by clever enemies. However, Sarah's obvious intelligence and sincere emotional connection to both sides of the conflict made it difficult to dismiss her testimony as the ravings of a confused widow. Her words had planted seeds of doubt about the simple moral calculus that had brought the tribunal to this point. When the formal testimony concluded, the tribunal recessed for deliberation that lasted 2 full days. Sarah spent this time in constant anxiety, knowing that the lives of 6 men hung in the balance and that her testimony might have influenced their fate in ways she would never fully understand. She walked the grounds of the fort with Scarface Charlie's wooden bow in her hands, feeling the weight of cultural responsibility that would continue long after the legal proceedings ended. The tribunal's verdict was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but perhaps represented the best outcome possible under the circumstances. Captain Jack and 1 other warrior were sentenced to death for the murder of General Canby and another peace commissioner. Scarface Charlie and 2 others received prison sentences that would eventually allow for their release. 2 defendants were acquitted entirely, their youth and limited involvement in the most serious violence earning them mercy from the military court. Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and heartbreak as the sentences were read. She had helped save some lives, but she had failed to prevent what felt like a final act of cultural destruction. Captain Jack faced his sentence with the same dignity he had shown throughout the trial, while Scarface Charlie's eyes found Sarah's across the courtroom in a look that conveyed both gratitude and an unspoken understanding about the work that would continue after the immediate crisis was over. In the days following the tribunal, Sarah made her preparations to leave Oregon and return to the East, where she planned to fulfill her obligation to carry the Modoc story to broader audiences. Congressman Morrison had arranged for her to speak to various groups in Washington and New York about her experiences, and several newspapers had expressed interest in publishing her account of the conflict from the perspective of someone who had known people on both sides. Wauka visited Sarah on her final evening at the fort, bringing with her a beaded necklace that had belonged to Scarface Charlie's mother. Through Father McKenna's translation, the elderly woman explained that the necklace would serve as a reminder of the spiritual family connections that transcended the physical separation that was about to occur. She also shared her belief that Sarah's work was just beginning, and that the young warrior's invitation to join his father's heart would guide her to opportunities for service that had not yet revealed themselves. As Sarah prepared to board the stagecoach that would begin her journey back to the East, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred during her months in Oregon. She had arrived as a grieving widow seeking closure about her husband's death, but she was leaving as someone with a profound sense of purpose and responsibility that connected her to issues of justice, cultural understanding, and the possibility of healing ancient wounds between peoples. The obsidian stone and the wooden bow that she carried with her represented more than souvenirs of an extraordinary experience. They were symbols of a commitment to continue the work of building bridges between different worlds, carrying stories across cultural divides, and advocating for understanding in places where fear and prejudice had previously dominated. The dying fire of her hope had been rekindled into something that would burn for the rest of her life, fueled by the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings could find ways to recognize each other's essential dignity and worth.